Welcome to Rome, around 57 AD. The emperor is Nero, and his empire is vast and confident and impressive, and yet beneath the surface, fragile. And right there in the city, there's a church. Not a building, but a people. Jews and Gentiles together. And because there are both Jews and Gentiles, there are questions that Paul will take up in his letter. Who really belongs? What is the place of the Jewish law? And how can a person be made right with God, especially a Gentile? So Paul writes to them from Corinth. He has long wanted to come to Rome and then head on to Spain afterwards. And so he writes ahead of his visit to introduce himself, to build partnership, and above all, to set out the gospel clearly. And what he writes here in this letter is the clearest, most carefully worked out explanation of the gospel anywhere in the New Testament. And we're taken in this letter right to the heart of God's gospel, which is the name I've given to this series. And we'll see what is wrong with the world and what God has done about it. We'll see what it means to be right with God and how that changes everything. We will see the gospel, God's gospel. And as we hear it and grasp it and are shaped by it and moulded by it, it will challenge us and it will change us. So let's begin. There are three things I want to point out in this opening passage. God's gospel is all about Jesus Christ. God's gospel is something that Paul longed to preach. And God's gospel is the power of God for salvation. First of all, then, God's gospel is all about Jesus Christ. Have a look with me from verse 1. Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God, the gospel he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures regarding his Son. Now, please note about Paul, he's a servant of Christ, he's an apostle that is sent from God, and he's been set apart for the gospel, for the purpose of making known, spreading this good news. And the gospel, he tells us, is the gospel of God. It's not something new. It's not something he's invented. It's the good news regarding God's Son. It was promised beforehand, but now seen, now revealed in the coming of Jesus the Messiah. And then appropriately for this first Sunday after Easter, we are told that we can have confidence that Jesus is the promised one by two means. First, that he was a descendant of King David, as the Messiah was always going to be. And secondly, Jesus' resurrection from the dead, which powerfully testifies to his true identity as the Son of God. The resurrection reveals him to be the Son of God in power. So, the gospel is completely grounded both in human history and in God's power seen at the empty tomb. So let's be clear at the start of Romans, at the start of this series, which, as I said, I've called God's gospel, that this is not made up. It's not a human concoction. It's certainly no fairy tale. Can I remind you, the gospel is not about religious observance or church attendance or doing good or being good, but about the good news of Jesus. It's all about Jesus. I heard of a priest once who cried out, "Why are they always going on about Jesus?" Answer, because God does. God is on about, all about Jesus. Which brings us secondly to God's gospel, which Paul longs to preach. Verse 13, he had planned many times to come to Rome that he might have a harvest among them, That's not a farming reference. He's talking about a spiritual harvest. You'll recall Jesus speaking about the fields ripe for harvest. And verse 15, he was eager to preach the gospel to those in Rome. Paul longs to preach. Now, let's just back up a little bit so we can see these verses in their context. The faith of the church in Rome is famous. Verse 8 is being reported all over the world. And that is why Paul wants to visit in person, verse 11. Not only so that he can be a blessing to them and preach the gospel to them, but that they might be a blessing to him. Verses 11 and 12, have a look. I long to see you that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to make you strong. That is, that you and I may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith. Now there's a beautiful little window into the understanding that Paul has of the relationship between Christians and Christian leaders and their people. Paul is not self-sufficient. He doesn't have an endless store of encouragement to hand out, but he's looking forward to being encouraged by them also. Friends, all ministry is meant to be mutual. I couldn't tell you the number of times I've gone to visit somebody on a pastoral call and I'm the one that's come away encouraged. That's how it will be. And this is the way that Christian ministry is meant to work. So that as God in his word says through Paul here, we might be mutually encouraged by each other's faith. Friends, if you're blessed to have a clergy person, work hard to be a blessing to them. We're meant to be mutually encouraging of one another. Now, Paul's chief role, chief ministry, was amongst the Gentiles, the non-Jews. They were always his focus. Paul said he's had a harvest elsewhere among Gentiles and he longs to see the same in Rome. Perhaps Paul is thinking of his time in Ephesus. When he arrived there were only a few believers, a fair bit of confusion, very little depth. But over time, by preaching the gospel, people became Christians and they turned from their idols. Leaders were raised up. So much so that the book of Acts says that the word of the Lord spread through the whole region from the work in Ephesus. That's what Paul means by a harvest. Not numbers on a page, but people rescued, changed, gathered into a living church. And Paul is saying, I've seen that happen elsewhere, and now I long to see that happen in Rome. Because, friends, there's nothing more important in a person's life than if they've never heard the gospel, to hear the gospel. So you'll see that there is an eagerness mixed with a sense of urgency here for Paul. I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. Now, we're not in the first century, and you and I are not apostles. You may not be called to preach, at least not publicly. But here's a challenge for us. Are we eager for those who haven't heard the gospel to hear the gospel? If we have grasped somehow how good the good news is, then we will also long in some way to live it, to speak of it, and to long that other people might hear it too. Because here's the thing, thirdly, God's gospel is the power for salvation. You know, if I share a newspaper article with you on the politics of the day, or if I share with you the Buddhist way of life or some philosopher's new approach, you might say to me, oh, that's nice, Mark, that's very interesting. You may even decide to embrace some of what I've shared with you. But there is no power in that article or in that philosophy to change you or for you to be changed. But the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, that's an entirely different category. The good news about Jesus is powerful. The good news about Jesus can save people. It's the power of God for salvation. Lives change under the power of the gospel. The lights come on, ears open, the scales are lifted from people's eyes, hearts soften to the loving invitation of Jesus in the gospel. So the gospel is not just information, it's not just advice, it's not a perspective on life, it is the power of God for salvation. God himself is at work through the message of Jesus to rescue from sin's clutches and death's power, to forgive sin, to reconcile people to himself, and to give new life now and forever. Notice Paul doesn't say it points to the power of God or contains the power of God. He says it is the power of God, which means when the gospel is spoken, God is at work. Only the gospel can rescue people, both Jew and Gentile. Only the gospel can bring about a change in someone's status before God from guilty to not guilty. Only the gospel can bring someone from death to life. I wonder if you have that confidence in the gospel, in the good news about Jesus. Do you believe it is God's powerful tool to bring people from death to life? His means of throwing out the lifebuoy to someone who is dying. His means of bringing hope to the hopeless and strength to the weak. Life, as I said, to the dead. This is precisely why Paul says he's not ashamed of the gospel. And that's striking because we know the pressure to stay quiet about the gospel, to stay quiet about Jesus, not to speak, not to stand out, not to risk sounding naive, not to risk being dismissed, to keep our faith private, to keep Jesus in the background. And into that, Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It alone has power to save, to rescue people. And he says that in this gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. That is, and we saw some of this on Good Friday, that in the gospel, a way, a means of being put right with God is revealed, which comes from God himself. A rightness with God which comes by trusting Jesus, trusting what he has done for us. Imagine for a moment you're stranded in the Blue Mountains. You've been on a hike and you've twisted your ankle. Your mates have gone on in front of you and you're out there and it's getting dark and cold and late. You're seeking help. You're able to make the call. There's no other way out. You're not getting yourself out there. There's no way that you can rescue yourself or walk. And then, because you've made the call, the rescue comes from above. The rescue helicopter is lowered. There's a rope lowered down, given to you. All you can do is to trust the lifeline that's been given to you. That's what's revealed in the gospel. Help from above when there's no way out. We're going to explore more of that as the series unfolds, because the righteous, those who are right with God, we read, live by faith. That is, by trusting what Jesus has done on his cross and in his resurrection. Well, let's see where we've come from today. God's gospel is all about Jesus Christ. Friends, there are many who want to make it about something else, almost anything else but Jesus. But Paul is clear, God is clear, I want to be clear. We're on about Jesus. And if you have ever said, oh, that bishop is always on about Jesus, and you might be annoyed by that, well, friends, I'm personally thankful because I'm on message with God and the Bible, and that can't be bad. Secondly, God's gospel is what Paul longs to preach, because there is nothing more important for those who have not heard the gospel than that they hear the gospel. It's a matter of life versus death. It's the difference between knowing about Jesus and knowing Jesus. So yes, I long to preach too, and I will do it until I retire in September, and then I'll keep on doing it in retirement, God willing. Non-Christians need to hear it, and usually Christians will love to hear the gospel time and again. Tell me the old story. And then thirdly, God's gospel is the power of God for salvation. And therefore, with Paul, I will not be ashamed of it, and I hope you won't either. Would you be ashamed of, let's say, a cure for cancer or a solution to the end of the war in the Middle East? Of course not. You would speak up. You would tell it from the rooftops. You would share it. You would tell anyone who would listen. The gospel of Jesus Christ is the best news ever. The power of God for salvation. I trust that you'll keep coming back through this series, throughout Romans, so that together we will better understand God's gospel.